on, Vikings, let's win this game.
There are days when it feels like everything around the Vikings points to the same question. Is this team building its next real step toward contention, or is it still feeling around in the dark? Because right now the conversation runs through a quarterback under pressure, a possible surprise trade, an explosive offensive target, the heir to a legend in the secondary, and even a reunion that could stir up this franchise's memory. And the truth is, some of these stories could seriously reshape the direction of the 2026 season. I want to start with the quarterback situation because, to me, that is where this team is going to live or die in 2026. And that is not exaggeration. When you look at what is being said about J.J. McCarthy, Carson Wentz, and Kyler Murray, what shows up is not just a normal training camp battle. What shows up is real tension over what direction Kevin O'Connell wants to take this offense moving forward. The story getting attention is the idea that the Rams could be involved in a major trade for J.J. McCarthy, and the fact that this even exists as a conversation already tells you a lot. McCarthy was a high draft pick. He was framed as part of the future, but now the environment has changed. The Vikings brought in Kyler Murray, and that changes the whole reading of the room. A lot of people believe Murray enters this battle as the favorite. Some are even going further and suggesting McCarthy could slide to third on the depth chart if Wentz is healthy and looks close to what he showed before the shoulder injury. That is heavy. Really heavy, because one thing is saying the kid is still developing. It is something very different to hit April hearing trade rumors and debates over whether he might not even be the top backup. The projected deal with the Rams centers around a second-round pick, and honestly, that opens a huge split among the fan base. Some people would look at that and say, take the pick and move on, but others would see it as a massive mistake because you would be giving up on a young quarterback way too early, one who has barely had real time to prove anything. I understand both sides. But from my point of view, the most important thing here is not even the Rams speculation. It is the internal message. If the Vikings truly believe McCarthy can still become the guy, then he needs to be treated like a live project, not like a trade asset waiting for a phone call. At the same time, if the staff sees Kyler Murray as the more ready-made answer for right now, then the pressure on him is going to be intense from the very first snap of training camp. And then there is another important detail. Chris Long said Murray needs to improve how he sees the field late in plays. That is not a small critique. He praised the mobility, but he also made it clear that when a play stretches out, Murray still does not always process the field the way he should. And if that keeps showing up, O'Connell is going to have a huge challenge adapting the offense without limiting the playbook too much. Athletic talent has never been the issue. The issue is whether he can run everything with consistency. Meanwhile, McCarthy is back in Minnesota, back in the building, training, getting stronger, and trying to attack this competition the right way. That tells me he is not hiding from the fight. Good. That is how it should be. But the clock has already started for him, and in Minnesota, patience with quarterbacks never lasts very long when the team thinks it should be competing right now. I will be blunt. Trading McCarthy right now feels too early to me unless somebody comes in with a ridiculous offer. Because if Murray is inconsistent and Wentz is not physically reliable, you could regret giving up a young quarterback with tools and pedigree in a hurry. But we also cannot pretend this rumor came out of nowhere. There is at least some smoke here. And while the fan base debates quarterback, the front office may already be staring at another position that needs immediate impact too. And that brings us to Devon Achane, because this is the kind of story that starts off sounding like a stretch, and then suddenly begins to make some sense when you really look at the roster. The Dolphins running back missed the first day of voluntary workouts. New head coach Jeff Hafley confirmed the absence, and talk of possible tension started picking up again. Miami says it does not want to trade him. Fine. But in the NFL, the phrase, "he's not available," almost never lasts forever. What reignited this was the context. The Dolphins have already made major moves with the roster. Big names are gone. The team looks like it is in a rebuild, and when a dynamic player like Achane is not there, the market starts putting the pieces together on its own. For Minnesota, that gets interesting for one simple reason. This offense is still looking for somebody who can turn an ordinary play into a touchdown at any moment. Achane is that kind of player. We are talking about a running back with an affordable salary and strong recent production on the ground. But even beyond the numbers, what pulls you in is the kind of threat he creates. He speeds the game up. He forces a defense to respect outside runs, checkdowns, and the possibility of an explosive play in a tiny amount of space. And let's be honest here, the Vikings' backfield has useful names right now, but it still does not scare anybody at that level. Aaron Jones is still a smart, experienced, dependable veteran. Jordan Mason can handle a physical role. But what is missing is that element that changes the geometry of a defense before the snap. That is why so many people look at Achane and think that is the fit, especially because Minnesota might not be in the perfect spot to land one of the most coveted running backs in the draft. so a trade becomes the shortcut. But every shortcut has a cost, and the question is whether it is worth spending draft capital at a position where the team already has bodies, but not necessarily elite explosion. To be honest with you, I completely understand the temptation, because putting a chain next to Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and a mobile quarterback like Kyler Murray would completely change the perceived speed of this offense. You would force defenses to defend horizontally and vertically on every snap. That is not a small thing. That changes game plans. That gives play action more life. That helps the offensive line. That opens windows for everyone. But there is another side to this too. If Miami really is rebuilding, why would it move a young, cheap weapon without asking for a meaningful return? And if the asking price climbs, should Minnesota really pay it? I do not know if I would go too far here. A modest pick, maybe. Burning a major asset on a roster that still needs help in other areas could get dangerous. Even so, when a general manager says he always listens and that nobody is untouchable, that is all it takes. The door is cracked open, and in the NFL, that is enough for speculation to turn into pressure. If the Vikings feel like they can add real explosiveness without compromising the future, this conversation is going to stay alive all the way up to the draft. And I would not be shocked if it heats up even more. But while the offense keeps grabbing attention, another part of this roster may be heading toward a very important changing of the guard. Now let's talk defense, because this projection really caught my attention, and it connects directly to a question this franchise has been putting off for a while. Who is going to be the heir to Harrison Smith? Just asking that question feels different, because we are talking about one of the most respected names in recent Vikings history. That is not just any roster spot. That is not just any transition. Peter Schrager mocked safety Emmanuel McNeil-Warren to the Vikings at number 18 overall. And that stands out because a lot of people had been connecting him to the Bears later in the first round. So the idea here is Minnesota stepping in earlier and taking a desired player away from a division rival. I love that kind of move when it is done with conviction. If you believe in the player, you do not wait for your rival to move first. What people like about McNeil-Warren is exactly the kind of profile that makes sense for this defense. A tall, rangy, energetic vocal safety with real takeaway production. That last part matters a lot to me because the Vikings have shown in recent years that when the defense can force mistakes, the whole team rises a level. And this kid comes in with a resume built on tackles, range, forced fumbles, interceptions, and physical presence. He is not just a raw athlete. He has experience. He has volume. He has real signs of impact. Physically, he gets your attention too. Bigger than the average safety. Good speed for the size, solid explosiveness, and maybe more important than anything, there is a feeling that he could get into the rotation early without looking lost. That matters when you are talking about a team trying to get back to the playoffs after a 9-8 season. You do not just want a long-term project, you want someone who can help soon. Now, of course, the draft is never a guarantee, and using a first-round pick on a safety is always going to divide people. Some fans are going to say the team should prioritize corner, defensive line, or another need they see as more urgent. I respect that argument. But there is also tremendous value in preparing the successor to an icon before the vacancy hits. Doing it after the retirement usually ends up costing more and feeling more desperate. And the point here is not just replacing Harrison Smith on paper. It is preserving the intelligence and communication structure of the secondary. When you lose a veteran like that, you do not just lose snaps. You lose command, pre-snap alignment, processing, and leadership in tense moments. So going after someone with energy and a strong voice can matter more than it looks like at first glance. That projection gets even more interesting because the Vikings may be in a rare position. The defense was very good overall, but there are still spots where a new playmaker could change the ceiling of the unit. If McNeil-Warren is truly that type of player, then you are not just filling a hole. You are trying to keep this defense relevant for the next several years. I like the aggression in this idea. I really do. Not because it guarantees success, but because it shows continuity of vision. And in the middle of all the quarterback talk, we sometimes forget that truly good teams also know how to prepare tomorrow without giving up on today. And if that question splits the fan base, just wait until we get to an even bigger name on the defensive front. Now the conversation gets heavy for real. Dexter Lawrence. Just hearing that name changes the whole tone of the debate, because now you are not talking about a prospect, a development piece, or a niche fit. You are talking about an established, dominant, expensive player. Very expensive. And when the idea surfaced that the Vikings could get involved, the first reaction from a lot of people was simple: go get him. The second reaction was a little more cautious. Hold on, is this really the right moment? Lawrence is reportedly seeking a way out of New York after frustrating contract talks tied to a deal that is already massive. And the number being mentioned is around $30 million per year. That is true star money. And he is, in fact, a game-changing player. We are talking about a defensive tackle who can collapse the pocket, swallow up the run game, and force offensive lines to redesign protection. Players like that do not show up every day. When they do, everybody pays attention. That is why the connection to Minnesota does not sound ridiculous. The Vikings have already shown they wanted to strengthen the interior defensive front. They tried to invest heavily before. They felt the absence of real impact there. So when a player of this caliber becomes even possibly available, it is natural to picture the team being interested. Especially if the cost in picks is not a first rounder but something like a second and a fifth, then the math starts to look very different. But that is also where the warning comes in. Tyler Furness argued that as much as Lawrence would help, this may not be the right time to make that kind of move. And I think that is an honest point, because a major trade is not just about the quality of the player, it is about where your roster actually is. If this team were one piece away from being a clear contender, I would say go for it. Push the chips in. But right now, there are still too many open questions at important spots. The biggest one is still quarterback, and that affects everything. If Kyler Murray fits perfectly, the Vikings can look at this season with a lot more ambition. If he is inconsistent, then building a wall inside on defense only goes so far if the offense cannot sustain drives, protect the football, and convert on third down. That is the NFL. Sometimes the shiny piece looks like it solves everything, but the structural issue is still somewhere else. At the same time, I am not going to pretend the idea of Dexter Lawrence in this defense does not excite me, because it absolutely does. A defensive line with real interior force changes life for the edge rushers, changes life for the linebackers, and makes the secondary's job easier. You shorten the opposing quarterback's clock. You create longer third downs. You impose physicality early in games. That has a chain reaction. So where do I stand? I would not trade the first-round pick. That feels too heavy to me. But if the price comes down to something like a second and a fifth, I would give it real thought, especially if the contract structure could soften the immediate cap hit. Then you would be buying proven production without completely wrecking your ability to keep building the roster. In the end, this debate says a lot about where the Vikings are as a franchise. This is not just a rebuilding team anymore. But it is not a machine with no flaws either. It is a roster sitting right on the line between boldness and restraint. And that is why a move like this could define a lot. But as always in Minnesota, the future is not only shaped by new additions. Sometimes it also runs into old ghosts and possible reunions that stir up the franchise's history. And to close out these stories, let's get into something that blends current roster need, nostalgia, and a good amount of off-field tension. The possibility of Stefon Diggs showing up on the Vikings' radar again. That alone is enough to light up the fan base, because Diggs is not just another former player. He is tied to a meaningful era of this franchise. So when his name starts circling again, nobody reacts to it in a neutral way. Jalen Nailor's departure opened a real hole at wide receiver 3. We are not talking about replacing Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison, but we are talking about filling an actual role in the rotation with someone who can produce without needing a huge target share. And that is where the options start to come into focus. Draft someone, trade for someone, or bring in a veteran. In that setting, Diggs looks like an obvious possibility because of the talent and the emotional connection to Minnesota. Adam Schefter pointed out that there is still a strong group of veteran receivers available this close to the draft, and Diggs is on that list. That alone makes the topic legitimate. It is not made up. The market is still open. The problem is that his situation is not only about football. There is an active legal issue in the background, and that naturally slows things down. Nobody wants to ignore that kind of factor, and nobody should. So let's separate it the way it should be separated. On the field, a healthy and focused Stefon Diggs would be a very interesting answer for the WR3 role. He understands route running. He creates separation. He knows how to read coverage, and he would not need to be the focal point in a room that already has Jefferson and Addison. In that role, he might even be a luxury. And there is something else too. A veteran like that helps a quarterback, especially if the team is still figuring out its offensive identity with Kyler Murray. But Diggs is not the only name in this discussion. DeAndre Hopkins also left the door open when he talked about Kyler Murray like family, and basically said if the Vikings needed him, he would be there. That matters too. Hopkins may not have the same physical peak anymore, but he still brings reliability, experience, and respect. So Minnesota could look at the market and weigh a reunion with Diggs against a Murray connection through Hopkins. If I have to choose between emotion and logic, I lean logic. Diggs back in Minnesota would be a massive story. It would make headlines. It would dominate the conversation for weeks. But it only makes sense if the legal situation is far enough along that it would not become a constant distraction. Otherwise, the risk starts outweighing the reward. Hopkins, meanwhile, may offer the steadier path even if there is less burst at this point in his career. Even so, the fact that the Vikings are being connected to names like these tells you the franchise understands the need in the receiver room. And that matters, because anybody who lives and breathes Vikings football every day knows a good offense does not survive a full season with only two main targets. You need depth. You need an answer when injuries hit. You need experience when games get bigger. At the deepest level, this whole story ties the picture together. Minnesota is looking for answers on several fronts at once. Quarterback, an explosive running back, defensive succession, a star in the trenches, a veteran pass game reinforcement. Ambition is not the problem. The problem now is figuring out which of these doors is actually going to open, and that, my friends, is exactly the kind of suspense that makes this offseason so fascinating. At the end of the day, what I see is a Vikings team at a decisive point. This is not a franchise standing still. This is not a roster with no direction, but it is also not a finished product where any move automatically becomes the answer. Everything comes down to making the right choice at the right time and accurately reading what this group really needs to rise another level. So now, I want to hear from you for real. Which one of these stories has the best chance to change the Vikings season, and what decision would you make today? Stay tuned. SKOL Vikings, let's go.